I have to start by saying that this is really my favorite kind of topic, right? This is a topic that is not owned by any discipline, where environmental science, arts, humanities inevitably commingle. We find an important topic and maybe it's a concept like empathy or creativity. Again, a topic that one discipline doesn't own, though, of course, it's often the case that disciplines think they own certain things because that's how disciplines roll. Or maybe it's a phenomenon like decomposition or trophic cascades, or maybe it's the interface between something like climate change or fire, or in this case, both. So we find that topic and we mull it, we rub it, we cogitate on it, and we hopefully walk away a little wiser and more knowledgeable and respectful of other approaches. And because of this, I have to tell you, you might not realize this, this evening is a deeply heretical activity that we need to keep far away from the delicate disciplinary sensitivities of a university campus. So I am really happy that we are squirreled away safely on Zoom. So thanks to the Eugene Natural History Society for taking this approach, for inviting a philosopher to talk about fire and philosophy and our uncertain future. I've divided my talk into acts. That seems kind of pretentious, but whatever. And I think of it as having basically 3 acts. And act 1 is really to talk a little bit about the Holiday Farm fire. So as we all remember, fire is something that we've lived with here for a long time, and we've recently lived with it in a very dramatic way. And this is something but I think it's important to just rehearse it. In the fall of 2020, just as we were getting used to living in the context of a global pandemic, a dramatic social and racial reckoning, a tumultuous political landscape, not to mention the background noise of facing the Earth's 6th mass biodiversity extinction. That is, as we were already living in the dark center of what my colleague Kathleen Dean Moore and I have recently referred to as the Venn Diagram from hell. A set of massive fires started in the Cascades. Many of us experienced the fallout of one of those fires, specifically the Holiday Farm fire. The Holiday Farm fire burned approximately 174,000 acres, which is nearly 131,000 football fields. I bet you didn't know that there is actually an acres to football field conversion website. I think there's more than one, actually. So at the Andrews Forest, just north of the point of ignition, the fire burned about 450 acres, including some of our experimental watersheds. And the fire suppression efforts caused some harm to our scientific infrastructure, a few $100,000 worth of damage, actually. But in the grand scheme of things, we were relatively unharmed and both incredibly lucky and incredibly loved and taken care of by those who were fighting the fires, for which we are incredibly grateful. So the Andrews Forest hosts one of 28 long-term ecological research sites, or LTR sites, around the country, and they're sponsored by the National Science Foundation. The Andrews Forest, which is also designated as a U.S. Forest Service experimental forest, was established in 1948 and became one of the first LTR sites in the country in 1980. As such, we have long-term measurements in climate, hydrology, vegetation. These measurements go back decades. Every 6 years, we write a renewal proposal to receive our funding, and we submitted our latest proposal in March of 2020, just as the pandemic hit. And we received our positive evaluation and renewal of our proposal in August of 2020, just before the fires hit. So the reason I tell you that is our thinking about the next 6 years was already kind of locked into that proposal, and we didn't actually include very much work on fire per se. But of course, since that time, our community has certainly been abuzz about fire. And I would say that this includes the part of our community that also includes the arts and humanities. And my own thinking about the connection between philosophy and fire has changed and developed a lot as well. So the purple is a very small part of the Andrews Forest. This is our headquarters area. This is the sort of edge of the Holiday Farm fire. It burned in our watershed, in some of our experimental watersheds, 9 here, all of watershed 1, and part of watershed 2. So that's about 450 acres that were burned in the fire. These are just some images from the fire. On the right, during the fire, in that same spot after the fire on the left. These are 3 images that actually our staff sent from their phones as they were escaping down Highway 126. So a burning landscape and burning buildings. It's hard to imagine driving through this. This is inside of watershed 1. It's a steep valley watershed. And so this is what watershed 1 or part of watershed 1 looked like immediately after the fire. And at the base of watershed 1 is a gauging station. And so you can see right in the middle of the shot, the fire got really, really close to some more of our infrastructure, our gauging station here. And in fact, if you zoom in on this side of the gauge station, you see that the fire burned right up to the concrete pad that the gauging station and some very expensive equipment on the right there, they sit on. You know, luckily concrete doesn't burn. That's the only thing that really saved us. And the fire was kind of, you know, winding down at that point. So this is another view of a near miss. Right at the bottom is a propane tank that got scorched. It's bad to put propane tanks into fires, I understand. Our folks tried to get out there as soon as it was safe and start doing their work and continuing their sampling regime. So we did that as quickly as we possibly could. And even though our headquarters wasn't hit by the fire, it was impacted by the creation of fire lines to protect the headquarters area. And you can see a sprinkler in the foreground of the image here. This was probably like what you were doing. This is at my house. We live in an old house with leaky windows, so I grabbed every bit of painter's tape I could find, and we were taping up windows, and we were taping air filters to box fans to create makeshift air filters in the house. I acknowledge my tape job here on the right is not very impressive, but we were in a hurry. It was the last filter I could find at Bimart. And some of the places that we know and loved along 126, like the Christmas treasure store here. This is where we used to tell people to turn to go to the Andrews Forest. You hit the Christmas store, you take a left. If you're coming from Eugene, it doesn't exist anymore. So we'll have to find a new marker. But Ike's Pizza does exist. You know, the fire was very selective, it seems like, in what it impacted. And what we did at the forest is we immediately created a part of our webpage to give at least daily updates of what was going on. And sometimes many days you can go to the website and you can kind of, you know, trace what we were experiencing through that time if you're interested. So it affected a lot of parts of our forest. People were evacuated sometimes in the middle of the night, and some really heroic activities were undertaken. It affected, we discovered a tree at the forest, a 500-year-old Douglas fir tree that really likes poetry. And so we named it the Poet Tree, and we created a Twitter page for it. So the poet tree was even tweeting during the fire. So that's a little bit of the Holiday Farm fire, and I'll move on to Act 2. So these are the facts of the matter, but we can also think in different ways about fire as well, or we can ask, do our recent fires give us an opportunity to think or rethink fire, and maybe even more than fire? So first things first, what in the world does philosophy have to do with fire, or does fire have to do with philosophy? So what I want to do is I want to provide a couple of ways that thinking about philosophy or thinking philosophically might help us to think about fire and maybe how to live with fire. You know, we talk a lot these days about having to learn to live with fire, but it's not always clear what that means when we say that, or how we might recraft our thinking and our communities in the face of our future with fire. So that's what I'd like to do, give us some structure, some scaffolding to help us think about fire. For me, the 2020 fires became philosophically and ethically interesting when we started to talk about recovery from the fires. Recovery is, or can be seen as, a concept, and philosophers analyze concepts. That's what we do, that's our jam. What we think about something like a fire, or nearly anything really, depends upon what we think about ourselves and the world around us in the first place. That is, it depends upon our worldview, the lens through which we look at and order, pattern, make sense of, and ultimately judge our world. So even the words we use betray components of our worldview, and recovery is a really good example of that. And this is certainly the case in the language we use in ecology. If we consider the etymology of the word recovery, the word recover comes to us from Latin and then Old French, and it finds its way into English. It means to return to reobtain, or resume a given state of mind or body, among other related words. So I think a relevant definition for us this evening might be to regain a former and better state or condition. The city soon recovered from the effects of the earthquake, someone might say, or they might ask, will Aunt Mary recover fully from her stroke? Or my uncle is a recovering alcoholic. Or as in the case at hand, how and when will the forest recover from the fires? And in all its meanings, recovery presupposes some things. It presupposes a natural or normal, healthy or good state, which is then disrupted somehow by some harm. Or as we try to neutralize and value sanitize things in ecology, the natural state is impacted, we say, by some change. This occurrence disrupted that better state, and what was harmed or changed is now working to get back to that former state. And we are possibly helping, or at least cheering on, nature to return to that former state. To the degree that something returns to that previous state, we say that it is recovered, it is made whole again. Interestingly, we are often not pointing to the same quality of a thing like an ecosystem when we assert or evaluate that it is recovered. Sometimes we're pointing to its appearance, right? The forest looks the same or nearly the same as it did before. Sometimes we're pointing to its function. The forest is still doing the same things that it did before. Sometimes we're simply pointing to its continued existence, or it's living in some way. Look at all the new plants coming into the burned area, we say. It's recovering. Ain't nature grand? And it's an interesting word too, because it's what we call a thick descriptor word. It's a word that not only describes some reality or some supposedly objective condition in the world, but it's one that is also value laden. And in this case, it's positively value laden. We think of recovery as good. It's like the word health in that way, both a description and a good thing. And in fact, it's actually a lot like health, because we're taking a word that evolved mainly to apply to humans and human health, and we apply it to some other realm, in this case, nature, or more specifically, ecosystems, or those ecosystems that have burned. When we do this, we can get confused. We are using a word metaphorically, but then the metaphor often gets confused with the real meaning or the real application, and the metaphor somehow becomes the reality or a reality. This is a very common occurrence. So I confess that in some ways, for me, at least at this moment in time, the fires and the notion of recovery actually create more confusion for me than clarity. They generate more questions than they do answers. And I think maybe that's okay. Maybe it's important to, as the scholar Donna Haraway puts it, it's important to stay with the trouble for a spell before we quickly move to try to address it and speak with it. We are often uncomfortable with staying with the trouble, but I think it's probably important to do it. So let's think a little bit about the history of ecology and fire and recovery from fire. Ecology often explains nature in metaphorical terms. In fact, ecology might be viewed as a science that's been engaged in a 100-year search for just the right metaphor to describe nature. It's interesting to consider fire and recovery in light of what are really the four dominant modes of ecological thought that we've seen over the past 100 years or so. So I just want to trace those paradigms in ecology and wonder about recovery and fire. So in the 1920s, ecologist Frederick Clements offered us what's become known as the superorganismic model of nature. Nature was, for Clements, like a superorganism, that is to say, like a giant organism, with giant systems of regulation and homeostasis. So a fire, even a very large one in this model, might be seen as a minimal disturbance, a flare-up, a blemish in comparison to a superorganism. So the superorganism is relatively unharmed, or the fire is easy to recover from in this case. But it's not clear that you cannot also apply the superorganismic metaphor to a forest, or to what we now think of as a forest ecosystem, which means that a large fire would be viewed as a harm to that superorganism, and therefore something to recover from. In short, I think it's hard to make sense of a large fire when we think in these, what we call Clementian terms, because it's not exactly clear at what scale the superorganismic metaphor applies. Does it apply to nature as a whole, or to a smaller scale, to what we call an ecosystem? So in the 1930s, Charles Elton proposed that nature was really like a community. Specifically, it was like an economic community. So he provided us with an economic metaphor, where everything plays a role as either a producer, think green plants, a consumer, think animals, or a decomposer, think bacteria and fungi. So in this economic metaphor, to do harm to nature is to disrupt or unbalance the proportions of these three economic roles. So here a fire might be viewed as harmful because it temporarily unbalances the economy of nature, and recovery is the trajectory toward a rebalancing of that economy. But here, a different trajectory of a forest set in motion by a fire might not be seen as a bad thing, since it's really about something, maybe anything, occupying the roles of producer, consumer, and decomposer. So I think, like the superorganismic model, it's not obvious to me that this model of nature allows us to think definitively about fire and the notion of recovery from fire. So in 1935, shortly after, in the search to make ecology more quantifiable and rigorous, Arthur Tansley and Ray Linneman coined the term ecosystem to describe nature and the workings of nature. They give us what's sometimes called the hydrologic metaphor, but instead of water in their system, we have energy flowing in a system, and energy can be traced, it can be measured, it can be quantified. We can have food webs that are essentially exchanges of energy as the fundamental structure of nature. In this view, a forest is a certain kind of energy network working in a certain kind of normal way. And a fire is a disruption to that energy network. And recovery is the regaining of the energy network that existed previously. Here, however, it's difficult to make sense of a disturbance like a fire and the notion of recovery. Does it have to be the same energy network? Can it be any energy network? Is it not a harm and therefore not in need of recovery as long as energy continues to flow in some way? I think the answer is just not obvious, not clear. So the last paradigm, the 1980s. In the 1980s, ecologists like Dan Botkin began talking more and more about disturbance as the norm of nature. Stasis doesn't exist in nature in this metaphor, and the harmony we look for is at best a discordant harmony. Constant change at various scales is in fact normal, is the background of nature. So if what is good and healthy or desired is what is natural, and if what is natural disturbance and change, it seems that a fire at any scale is not only normal and natural, but is good and healthy as well, at least from an ecosystemic point of view. Fire, floods, storms, like shit happens. And it's very difficult to make sense of the notion of recovery here. Recovery itself seems to presuppose a kind of stasis as a reference toward which a forest or an ecosystem can move. If there's only multi-scale disturbance, if that's the norm, then there's no reason there is no recovery, it seems. It's just one change developing into another change. So in short, I don't think our current ways of thinking about nature, ourselves, and our relationship with nature as they are optimized in ecology allow us to make a tremendous amount of sense of at least the notion of recovery from fire. And I actually think there's a really good reason for that, and more about that in a minute. As a way to transition, I want to take what seems like a radical term, but I assure you it's not. I want to spend just a moment on the concept of indigenous burning. We sometimes point to indigenous people and their use of fire in relationship with the land. We point mainly to their actions as an indication that we to live with fire. But I would actually challenge us to a little bit more here. Practices like the use of fire, practices are rooted in worldviews. They're rooted in belief systems. And it's not obvious that you can simply appropriate a set of practices and plop them into an unfamiliar or even hostile belief system. I think the real challenge for us is something different or additional. It's developing or redeveloping a new worldview that allows us to see fire as part of our larger moral community. This means giving up, I think, on certain dimensions of our current worldview, most notably the sickness of anthropocentrism, the belief that we're separate from nature and superior to the world. It's hard to imagine a healthy relationship with anything if you view it only as a means to your end. So I think there's more work to be done on this topic. And that's the last thing I want to address. So Act 3. The next thing I want to do is I want to tell you a story. And this is a story of how fire played an important central role in very early philosophical thought. I wrote this story down. It's the introductory essay for a catalog of an art exhibition book featuring the work of Portland artist David Carmack Lewis. And he had a fire-focused exhibit entitled "A God in the Hearth." So what I want us to do is I want us to jump into the Wayback Machine, and I mean way back. I want to go back to ancient Greece, hundreds of years before the Common Era, hundreds of years BCE. I want us to think about Heraclitus and meet Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a philosopher in ancient Greece around 500 BCE. He was embroiled in a generation-old debate about the ultimate structure and form of the universe. What is it the Greeks wanted to know that explained everything else? What was the fundamental substance of the universe? What was, to use their word, arche? So Heraclitus had a whole bunch of nicknames. He was called the Riddler. He was called the Obscure. He was called the Weeping Philosopher. He was called the Dark One, because people actually thought his philosophy was really pessimistic and depressing. For him, fire was actually the substance that explained everything else. Fire represents the contrasting character of the world because it's simultaneously stable. A flame's form is relatively constant and changing. Within a flame, all is change. And fire, too, has the power to change its surroundings, the power to be both a force of destruction and of rebirth. Everything changes and is in flux, Heraclitus observed. Change is core. So this, what we might call fluxy view of nature, suggests that reality is not, in fact, composed of any number of substances that are material and eternal and reducible, but rather it is a process of continual creation and destruction. The phrase, "you can never step in the same river twice," is probably the most common expression of Heraclitus's philosophy. So we might ask, what are we supposed to do with that? And I think there are some things to do with that. We who live in the dominant Western culture, we're caught in a bit of a dilemma in our search for stasis and permanence, for predictability. We find that all around us, in Heraclitus's view, is only change, flux. Our recent fires illustrate this point perfectly. And of course, change, for those of us of the Western persuasion, the Western worldview, it makes us uneasy. How often have you heard, oh, people don't like to change? At the same time, there are changes, there are ephemera that we do embrace. We would never try to capture a summer wind in a jar or to paint a portrait on an autumn chanterelle. These are things whose wonder and beauty we know is tied directly and completely to their ephemeral nature, and we love them for that. So to our ear, when I talk about Heraclitus and what he was doing, trying to find the ultimate stuff of the universe, to our ear, it sounds like the ancient Greeks were engaged in what we think of as science. In a way, that's absolutely true, they were. They craved rigorous and systematic and empirical explanations for the reality that we experience in the world. That sounds like science. In fact, Heraclitus believed this search for structure was the single highest human pursuit possible. You could do nothing with your life that was noble than that. That sounds like a lot of my science colleagues. They would agree. But it's critical to note that while certainly sciencey, Heraclitus and his colleagues were embarked, in fact, on a hallowed mission. The search for arche was actually a search for the central and eternal substance, the search for the substance causing all change and motion. It was a search for the divine. It was a search for the sacred. Heraclitus is in fact suggesting that fire is sacred. Fire is a divine substance. Fire is most certainly a god in the hearth. And one more thing, because fire is both divine and the source and substance of everything, by extension, the world around us becomes sacred too. Fire and the world built upon it possesses what current philosophers would refer to as intrinsic value, value transcending use value, value we associate with our children, maybe our most precious family heirlooms, and certainly our fellow human beings. Fire's universality radiates outward, transferring that intrinsic value to the entire world. So I would ask, can we imagine, or I think maybe reimagine that world? Maybe this is our great challenge, to reimagine and remake a world that is sacred. Uta sacris, from the Latin, to set apart, to make holy, to immortalize. And in this world of change and fire and the sacred, can we reimagine our own place in that world as well? If this is our task, to make the world once again sacred and to find our way in it, we need all hands on deck. We need scientists and ethicists and politicians and business leaders, sure. But we also need artists and writers and poets and musicians and dancers. We're called to perhaps the greatest exercise in moral imagining in the history of the world. How can we possibly bring this new world into existence without the full power and force of the human imagination? So that's another way to think about fire, to remind ourselves that fire, even in our own culture, plays a central role philosophically and, in fact, morally. I think we have to get better at seeing of our problems and our challenges. Fossil fuel addiction, massive fires, climate change, biodiversity loss, these are moral crises as much as they are anything else. We face a philosophical crisis, a moral crisis, and we need all the moral rally points we can muster. Art can serve that function, philosophy can serve that function, science can serve that function, or they cannot. All of our disciplines and the spaces, I would say, in between our disciplines can prompt our imaginations, prompt our conversations, prompt our thoughts about what kind of people we will be, what kind of world we will bring forth, prompting not just reflecting new ways of life on this bruised and blessed earth. I would like to close out with a short reading from one of my favorite current writers, He's a poet. He lives in Ohio. His name is Jared Anderson. And he offers, I think, some really nice advice for the fluidness of mind that the future asks of us. Well, I think demands of us, really. So he writes this: as forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, and an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It is not an age for towers. It is an age for stubborn flowers. So thanks again for the invitation, and I'm done finally, and I can join you for a glass of wine.
So we'll jump into questions, and just quickly, I wanted to say I really appreciated what you said about indigenous burning practices and the fact that we can't kind of take that, we can't take the practice out of its cultural context and expect it to work in the same way now. And you know, a lot of us who are kind of working in the context of trying to put fire back to the land have come to recognize that recently. And it's this idea that you have to put it in a new context, make it work in the world we're living in now. So it's kind of a changing of a worldview. And I mean, how does that happen? How long does that take?
I think it depends. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because I think the worldview that we have now was the strong version of the word would be a betrayal of our own ancestors. It was clearly a turning away from this idea that to search for the substance of the universe was to search for the sacred. But at the same time, I blame philosophers for this. It was philosophers who in ancient Greece were continuing this conversation about the ultimate stuff of the universe, and decided at the end of the day that it was atoms that were the ultimate stuff. And for the Greeks, they were tiny little solid hard particles. So the world was kind of snapped together by a bunch of atom Legos, and its sacredness was reduced. These ideas were picked up. They formed the basis of some of our religions. They were picked up in the Renaissance by people like Descartes and Bacon and Newton. They found a perfectly brutal marriage in the Industrial Revolution, and they were incredibly powerful. I think we live at the end of a 400-year absolutely failed experiment, and that one way or another that worldview will change. And I think we find resonance with a different worldview with our indigenous colleagues. I think we find it even in little places in our own culture, and I think we find it in the history of our own culture. So I don't know. The thing that we probably can rest assured is that the people who benefit from the current way of doing things will fight like hell to not allow that to happen. They have no interest in reimagining our place in the world. So I don't know. Kathleen Moore and I have been talking about this a lot lately. We've been talking about what we call intellectual restorative justice, that we philosophers broke it, and maybe we should work to fix it in some way. So that's what's occupying our time these days.
Well, thank you. Next question comes from Tom Titus.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. I'm really struck by the language that we have surrounding fire and how much it shapes our attitudes about fire, and what it looks like to develop a language that might be more fluid around fire. I just actually only visited the Holiday Farm fire for the first time last week, even though it burned within 10 miles of my mother's house, and I was working like hell to try and make the place fire resistant in the process. But I didn't find myself overcome by all those adjectives that I've heard bandied about, around the fire. as my buddy who I went up there with said, I found myself more devastated standing in the middle of a clear cut in the Coast Range, quite frankly. So anyway, I just wanted to hear what you have to say about that, just language.
Yeah, I mean, our language is absolutely our reflection of our view of the world. I mean, we just, we use adjectives or any kind of descriptions, and they feel comfortable to us if we view the world in a certain way, and they feel uncomfortable. And I think that's a really good question, because I think it can change in a couple of ways. You might say, oh, if we change our worldview, then our language will change. I think you can start to change your language and your worldview will change. There was a story that I shared with Robin Kimmer that shows up in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And it's the story of my Western scientist colleagues who are field ecologists. And one of the first things that I notice about how they speak is they personify the world. So when they're at a moose lick, they're wondering, if someone was there that day, or if a fly is in their ear. They say someone's buzzing in my ear. And so I think, we have language that can personify and animate nature, and we can choose to use it. And I think that starts to impact us in some way, and it stops sounding weird over time. So I think language use can influence that kind of moral growth or development. So that's a great question. Thanks.
That was a great answer too. Our next question comes from David Wagner.
Hi, I really like the different views you had of nature by ecologists, and Botkin's nature as a disturbance. And I was thinking, well, nature as disturbance, but does the concept of punctuated equilibrium that paleontologists use fit in with that? That it's not necessary, that it could be continuous, or I'm a punk eat guy, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there are times where it doesn't seem to be disturbance, right? There's stasis. We can't always predict when those times are, but there are times that seem to be fairly static. And the reality is that they're probably static at the scale that we're experiencing them, and probably not static at some other scale. So I think the question for disturbance ecologists in that view is like, you have to say more than that. Disturbance can exist at various scales. How chaotic are you actually describing the world? And I don't think that's always very, very clear, or there's disagreement among people who embrace that view. And it's not a view that's an old view. We saw it in Heraclitus. You see it in Gleason in 1926 in his views of ecology. So the paradigms that I kind of portrayed, they overlap with one another. And actually, interestingly, they pile up on one another. So I had a student do an exercise one time where they took a bunch of ecology textbooks over the course. There were textbooks for over a 30-year span, and they wanted to see how often different paradigms showed up, and if there was a lag between the development of the paradigm and how it shows up in ecology textbook, and then do they replace one another when a new one shows up. And what she discovered is they don't replace one another, they just pile on top of one another. And the epitome was this paragraph that she found that had every metaphor in ecology sort of wrapped into a single paragraph, and the paragraph made no sense whatsoever. But it had all the ecology words. It had all of them in one paragraph. So it was a great exercise, and a little frustrating at the same time.
Great. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. All right, do we have any other questions from the floor? All right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just not struggling, but I was surprised when you brought up the indigenous folks burning, and then I think it was somehow connected to our controlled burning, and how can we do that? I look at controlled burns as just we're using that instead of mechanical or chemical reasons to get rid of things that we don't want, which is another story. So I guess I miss that connection somewhat.
Yeah, in some ways, I really appreciate the fact that we look to indigenous cultures for clues and tips about how we might live with the land. I think in some ways, I think of that as a gesture of respect. I think there's a very fine line between respect and simple appropriation of ideas. And I think that, and I'm concerned that simply borrowing a set of ideas from a different culture and overlaying it, trying to overlay it onto a culture that's in fact hostile to the worldview that brought forth those ideas. I find that, I worry that something like that can't ultimately be successful in one way or another. And I also just worry about the idea that we once again are appropriating something from indigenous cultures that's problematic on its own. And so then what I was trying to do was transition into, well, maybe we have similar ideas in our own culture if we go back far enough. I mean, if we go back far enough, all of our ancestors were bloody pagans and animists. And Heraclitus is a great example of that, even in our own culture. We stopped paying attention to that, but it's there. So maybe we can find the roots of ideas about nature that would then support, would support something like indigenous burning. There'd be a continuity between our view of the world and this kind of practice that we engage in.
I have a question. Doesn't one of the elements that we have now that during these times that we use as examples of indigenous practice, the bugaboo to me seems like we have not adjusted to factoring in population and how we have to reimagine the world in a much more populated state. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that population is another extension of our worldview. The idea that we could sort of grow indefinitely because we'll always find ways to make nature provide. I want to say we assume nature provides. It's really we make nature provide. So unlimited human population growth isn't really of concern. If we thought differently about nature, or if we thought that what nature provides are not natural resources but gifts, and we had a reciprocal relation or reciprocal responsibility nature, we might think very differently about how we decide to reproduce. It might influence us in more profound ways than we can anticipate. So I think of these things as practices. The practice of reproduction, like the practice of burning, they make sense given certain assumptions about the world. If those assumptions change, those practices are less comfortable, perhaps, or they eventually change in kind.
Thank you.
All right. I just really quickly want to say, I think it's important to note too that some of the work around prescribed burning, controlled burning isn't necessarily just Euro-Americans taking that, but it's also trying to really allow that practice to be done again by indigenous peoples. And so that's, there's a bit of a difference there too as well. And I think a difference too is that our world has changed, the human culture has changed, but the natural world hasn't. That worldview has remained the same, right? And so the oak savanna that relied upon that, every 1, 2, 3 year burn, that hasn't changed. And so I think that that's an important consideration as well when we think about, our relationship and responsibility to the land and what it means to live in a place.
Yeah, those are great points. Great points.
I have a question, or ask for comment, and that has to do with our emotional attachment to nature, and if being either scientists or academic philosophers makes our intellect an obstacle to what I would call a spiritual and emotional connection to nature that is nonverbal and in many cases translated into religions around the world. And if understanding fires and all of this doesn't have some sort of, couldn't have some sort of basis in an emotional or spiritual connection to nature.
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about it. Do our big brains get in the way at times? And our training, right? You know, to be skeptical, bordering on cynical, and professional naysayers and things like that. And so we, and the other thing that's probably really problematic is we draw clean distinctions. We try to between that which is rational and that which is emotional. I mean, we all hear this all the time, right? That you can't argue with those people. They're just emotional. They're not rational. We always happen to be on the side of the rational because that's the good. And I don't think it actually works that way. I think I think we should be suspicious of any dualism. There's a joke in ecological modeling that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think the same thing is true of dichotomies. They're all probably wrong. The world's not one way or another. It's fuzzier than that. So I do think we throw up some roadblocks for ourselves that we need to get around, because the things that I'm really talking about, the words that drive us are things like love and care. They have an emotional dimension to them to be profound, but they're not without reason. I mean, there's a reason why I love something, and I can explain that. And my professing to love it doesn't, sort of negate the fact that I have a reason for it. These things can exist side by side. We know they do in our lives. We struggle with that dualism.
Yeah.
Michael, I have kind of a nuts and bolts question, just having to do with the long-term view of recovery. And given climate change, given that landscape has largely been removed of cover, and what's that? Is there a sense there at Andrews on the part of the forest ecologists in terms of what might be an outcome and for that forest out into the future? I mean, I'm looking up onto this hillside up the Mackenzie, and I can see this little patch of remnant oak, white oak savanna up there. And I'm wondering, is that the future of the Mackenzie River drainage, and for that matter, the Sandy Am? Is there any discussion about that?
It's not something I've been privy to. There might be a discussion, but I think in some ways we're still reeling. Most of us were spending the first 6 months after the fire just dealing with logistics and paperwork, and we weren't even able to reflect upon what was going on. There was such an urgency, but I haven't heard those conversations. What's next? What happens now? Do we just try to put it back the way it was? What do we do about that? That's a great opportunity for a pretty rich conversation, and one that could be really creative, or the opposite of that, I guess. But it's an opportunity maybe for a different kind of conversation. We better have it, because there's no reason to think this is going away anytime soon.
I can just imagine going out there and replanting that thing with a bunch of Douglas fir seedlings that just get scorched, for example.
That would probably be the background assumption, is that's what we would do, but I'm not sure.
Right. Well, that was a fantastic discussion. I don't want to end it. If there's anything else left, of course, I also want to be considerate of your time.
It's okay. I have my wine, so I'm fine.
Well, all right, fair enough. But I think that wraps things up. I thank you. I really appreciated that discussion. That was really, really wonderful.
It was great. Thank you all very much.
I'll give another round of applause.